Hello everyone, please tell me. Which city are you listening from? What time is it there? It was later than I realized. The kind of night where the world outside seems to fade away and you're left in a quiet space of your own thoughts. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, its sound sharp in the otherwise still apartment. I had been working all day, my desk cluttered with papers and half-finished ideas, and now I was just trying to finish up one last task before going to bed. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, my thoughts kept drifting. I sat at my desk, typing away at my laptop, when I noticed the lamp on the side table flicker. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but there was a faint stutter in the light that made me stop. I glanced up, wondering if maybe the bulb was going out. But before I could check, the light flickered again, this time more pronounced, the glow dimming and brightening in rapid succession. I frowned, annoyed at the interruption. I got up from my chair and walked over to the lamp, adjusting the switch to see if that would help. The bulb seemed fine, no burning smell, no signs of anything wrong. I flicked it on and off a few times, but the flickering continued. It was as if something wasn't right with the electrical wiring, or perhaps something deeper. I sighed and sat back down at my desk, deciding to ignore it for now. But as I turned my attention back to my work, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. The air in the room felt thicker, heavier, as though the flickering of the light had somehow shifted the atmosphere. I glanced back up at the lamp and froze. In the reflection of the lampshade, I saw someone standing behind me. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks. It had to be a mistake, a trick of the light, or maybe the angle of the room making things look odd. But no, the figure was unmistakable. A person, standing there in the reflection of the lamp, just behind where I was sitting. I whipped around in my chair, my heart pounding, expecting to see someone standing in my apartment. But there was nothing. The room was empty, just as it had been when I entered. Confused, I looked back at the lamp. The figure was still there, perfectly clear in the reflection and indistinct shape. A dark silhouette of a person, their features obscured by the dim light. I could see their outline against the wall behind me, the same way you see someone in a mirror when you're not looking directly at them. But this wasn't a mirror. It was the reflection of the lamp, and the person standing in it wasn't real. They couldn't be. I felt a cold shiver creep down my spine. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the reflection, trying to make sense of it. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, facing me. Their presence was unsettling, like a weight pressing down on me, an invisible hand on my chest. I leaned closer to the lamp, my fingers trembling as I reached for the light. I flicked the switch again, this time hard, but the reflection remained. The figure in the lamp didn't disappear. They were still there, standing silently in the glow, and now I could see something else. Their face? It wasn't clear at first, just a shadow, a blur of movement. But then it became clearer, more defined. And what I saw made my stomach lurch. It was my face. The figure's face was almost identical to mine, but not quite. The features were too sharp, too still, as though frozen in place. There was a coldness in their eyes, an emptiness, and the longer I stared, the more it felt like I was looking at a version of myself that didn't belong. A reflection of me that had come to life in a way I couldn't understand. I backed away from the desk, my mind racing. I was gasping for air, trying to make sense of it. What was happening? Why was my reflection standing there, looking back at me, without moving? Was I imagining it? Was I hallucinating? I stood up, shaking now, my legs weak beneath me. I turned away from the lamp, but the reflection stayed, like it was following me. I couldn't take my eyes off it. My heart was racing, pounding in my ears. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't alone. The figure in the reflection wasn't me. Not really. They were me, yes, but they were also something else, something wrong. They weren't just a mirror image. They were an empty version of me, standing there in the light, waiting. Without thinking, I ran to the window, threw it open, and breathed in the cold night air, trying to calm myself. The wind hit my face, sharp and real, and for a moment, it felt like the world was still normal, like I could escape whatever was happening in that room. But as I turned back, toward the desk, my eyes instinctively went to the lamp. The figure was gone. The reflection in the lampshade was just the usual glow of light. No shadow, no presence, just the flickering bulb. It was as though it had never been there at all. I stepped closer, my breath shaky, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But the unease in my chest didn't go away. I sat back down at my desk, trying to steady my hands, but my heart was still hammering in my chest. I had to focus. I had to forget what I had just seen. Maybe I was exhausted. Maybe I was imagining things after too many long hours of work. But the question wouldn't leave my mind. Asterisk, what if I wasn't imagining it? I looked at the lamp again. The light flickered once, twice, and then steadied. The reflection was normal now, just the soft glow of the room. But for a split second, I thought I saw it against something in the corner of the reflection, something moving. I blinked, and it was gone. But deep down, I knew. The reflection wasn't over. It hadn't finished showing me what it wanted to. And somewhere, in the back of my mind, I could still feel those eyes watching me. It was a Saturday afternoon when I first saw her. I was at the local park, trying to get some fresh air after a long week of work. The sun was barely peeking through the clouds, casting a muted light over the trees and pathways. The air was crisp, the kind of cool breeze that makes you feel alive, yet relaxed. I had no particular reason to be there other than to clear my head. A simple stroll among the usual sights, the children playing in the distance, the elderly couple sitting on the bench, the joggers running past in their usual rhythm. But then I saw her. She was sitting on one of the benches, off to the side, beneath a large oak tree that shaded the area. At first I thought nothing of it. She was just another person in the park, maybe reading or simply enjoying the peaceful afternoon. But as I walked closer, something about her caught my attention. She was alone, dressed in a simple white dress, her long dark hair spilling over her shoulders. She seemed so still, almost statuesque, in a way that felt unsettling. The air around her seemed to hold its breath, as if the world had momentarily paused just for her. I kept walking, trying to shake the feeling that there was something off about her. But the more I moved, the more I couldn't seem to look away. It wasn't just her stillness, it was her face. She was looking straight ahead, her lips curved into a gentle, almost serene smile. There was nothing threatening about it. Nothing wrong, at first glance. Just a simple smile, one that seemed warm, even welcoming. But her eyes were empty. I froze. The smile was soft, inviting, but her eyes were completely hollow. No emotion, no depth. Just two black pits that reflected nothing. It was like looking into a void, a space where no light could penetrate. The absence in her gaze sent a wave of unease through me, a creeping chill that crawled up my spine. It wasn't just that her eyes were dark, but that they seemed to pull me in, to make me feel as though I was drowning in them, caught in a gaze that didn't belong to any living person. I stood there, a few feet away, my feet frozen to the path. I couldn't understand why I felt this way, why I was so paralyzed by her presence. People smiled all the time. People stared into the distance all the time. Why did this feel different? For a moment, I thought about walking away, turning around and leaving, but my legs wouldn't move. My eyes couldn't stop looking at her, even though every instinct in my body was telling me to turn away. Her smile never faltered. Her posture remained perfectly still, like she was carved from marble. And then, without warning, she turned her head slightly, just enough to meet my gaze. For the briefest moment, I thought she might speak, or that something might break the silence between us. But she didn't. She just stared at me, her smile still in place, and the emptiness in her eyes grew deeper, darker. It felt like time had stopped. I wasn't sure if she had been watching me before, or if this was the moment she had noticed me, but everything about the interaction felt wrong, like something in the world had shifted, just a little. Finally, I managed to take a step back, my pulse quickening. I turned around and walked away, my eyes darting to the ground, trying to shake off the feeling that had crept into my chest. The unsettling sensation of her gaze lingered, though even as I continued walking, I felt as though she was still watching me. Her eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, seemed to burn into the back of my mind, leaving a mark that wouldn't fade. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was nothing more than my own mind playing tricks on me. I was just tired, stressed, maybe even a little anxious. But the further I walked, the stronger the sense that something wasn't right became. It gnawed at me, gnawed at my every thought. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but that feeling stayed with me. The unsettling sensation of those empty eyes. And every now and then, when I'd glance up, I swore I could see her smile at me from the corners of my vision, even though I knew she couldn't be there. The next morning, I decided to go back to the park. I had to make sure that I hadn't imagined it, that I wasn't just overreacting to a strange, fleeting moment. It was early, and the park was still quiet, with only a few early risers strolling along the paths. I walked to the same bench, the spot where I had seen her the day before. The oak tree was still there, casting long shadows on the ground, but the bench was empty. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe I had just been too tired, too caught up in my own thoughts. But then I noticed something, a small piece of paper folded neatly on the bench. I walked closer, curiosity stirring within me, and picked it up. Unfolding it, I saw just a few words written on the page, in neat, precise handwriting. Asterisk, I'm still here. I looked around, suddenly feeling cold again, but there was no sign of anyone. No sign of her. The park was empty, just as it should be. But I could feel it, the weight of her gaze, pressing down on me, even without her there. I crumpled the paper and shoved it into my pocket, feeling a shiver crawl up my spine. I couldn't shake the thought that I had seen her again, even though I knew I hadn't. I couldn't explain it, couldn't make sense of it. But I knew one thing for sure. That smile, that empty smile, would haunt me for a long time to come. And as I walked back toward the exit, I could feel her presence beside me. I just knew that, wherever I went, she was still watching me. And her eyes, those empty, unblinking eyes, would always be there. It started as a normal morning. The kind of morning you don't think twice about. The sky was overcast, but it wasn't too cold. The city around me humming with its usual noise. Cars honking, people chatting, the distant rumble of trains. I was running a little late, as I always was, but that didn't bother me. I had time to catch the bus, time to grab my coffee, and time to slip into the routine that felt as natural as breathing. I stepped out of my apartment building and into the street, walking briskly toward the bus stop. There was a slight chill in the air, the kind that made you wrap your scarf a little tighter, but nothing out of the ordinary. The street was busy, as it always was at this hour, with people rushing to work, on their phones, or simply lost in their own world. As I walked past the bakery on the corner, I saw her, a woman, mid-30s, with dark hair and a simple coat. She was walking briskly in the opposite direction, head down, eyes focused on the sidewalk. There was nothing unusual about her. She was just another person in the crowd. But I remember her because she looked so familiar, like I had seen her before. I couldn't place it, but something about her face, the way she moved, stuck with me. I didn't think much of it and kept walking toward the bus stop. I checked my watch, still plenty of time. As I waited for the bus, I glanced around at the other commuters, the familiar faces from every morning. I adjusted my bag, pulled out my phone, and checked the time again. The bus should be here any second now. And then I saw her again. It was the same woman. Same dark hair, same build, same brisk walk. But this time, her clothes were different. The coat she was wearing was a light gray, instead of the dark blue one I had just seen moments earlier. She was walking in the same direction, but this time, she wasn't coming from the same direction I had just passed her. In fact, it looked like she had never crossed my path before. The way she moved was exactly the same, but the coat was different, and I was certain she had been in front of me just moments ago. I stared for a moment, feeling the strange, almost uncomfortable sensation that comes with déjà vu. I wasn't sure if it was just my mind playing tricks, if maybe I had just seen someone who looked similar, but it wasn't a feeling I could shake. The bus arrived just as I was trying to process what had just happened, and I stepped on, quickly brushing the thought aside. I found a seat by the window and settled in, the strange encounter fading to the back of my mind as the bus pulled away. But then, I saw her again. This time, she was crossing the street, standing on the corner as the bus passed by. I recognized her instantly, but what I couldn't shake was the way her clothes had changed once more. She was wearing a completely different outfit, now a red jacket, paired with black jeans, and she had the same calm, purposeful expression on her face. I watched her for a few moments, trying to figure out what was happening, my pulse quickening. It didn't make sense. How could she have been in front of me just minutes ago, wearing a completely different coat? How could she have been walking in the opposite direction when I was sure we had crossed paths before? I strained my memory, trying to piece it together, but it felt impossible. It was like I was trapped in some loop I couldn't break free from. I tried to dismiss the thought, chalking it up to my mind wandering, to the fact that the city is full of people who look alike. But when I reached my stop and stepped off the bus, I saw her again. She was walking down the same street, but this time, she was wearing yet another outfit. This time, a long sweater and a scarf, a completely different look from the others. She passed by me without acknowledging my presence, her gaze fixed forward, as if she didn't even notice me standing there, staring at her. My mind was racing now, my heart pounding. I couldn't take it any longer. I stepped forward, walking in her direction, needing to know if this was all just a coincidence, a trick of the mind. I had to understand what was happening. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaking slightly as I caught up to her. I feel like I've seen you before. Just now, a few minutes ago. You were wearing a different coat, and then another one. How is that possible?" She stopped walking and turned to look at me, her expression unreadable, like she was deciding whether or not to speak. I saw her eyes flicker for a moment, as though something was going on behind them, something I couldn't grasp. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice calm, almost detached. "I don't think I've seen you before." I blinked, taken aback by the flatness of her response. Her face was so familiar, and yet she was acting like she had no idea who I was. She turned away, her steps quickening as she walked down the street, leaving me standing there, dumbfounded. The world around me felt too quiet, too still, and my heart raced in my chest. I watched her disappear around the corner, a strange sense of dread filling me. I glanced around, hoping to see something that would make sense of it all. But the street was the same as it always had been. The people walked by, oblivious to the fact that I was standing there, feeling completely lost. The feeling of having seen her, of passing her multiple times, kept gnawing at me. And for the first time in my life, I wondered if I was losing touch with reality. I couldn't let it go. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept walking, my eyes scanning the street for any sign of her, but she never appeared again. Not that day. But the next morning, I saw her again. This time, she was standing by the coffee shop I passed every day, her back to me. She didn't look at me as I walked by, and she didn't change clothes this time. She was just there, unmoving, as though she was waiting for me. And as I passed, I heard her whisper softly, barely above the noise of the city, "You're not the one who should be looking for answers." It had been a long day, one of those where the hours just seemed to drag on. and by the time I found myself stepping into the elevator at the end of the workday, I was more than ready to go home. The building was quieter than usual. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the only sound breaking the silence as I pressed the button for the ground floor. It was late, and most people had already left. Just a few stragglers left in the office, working into the night. The elevator was empty, the car humming softly as it descended. I leaned against the wall, lost in thought, counting down the seconds until I could get to the warmth of my apartment. The numbers above the door blinked in their usual rhythm, 10, 9, 8, 7. Down, down, down. But when the elevator door finally opened, it wasn't the familiar lobby of the building that greeted me. It was a room I had never seen before. I blinked, unsure if my eyes were playing tricks on me. The room in front of me was dimly lit, the walls a dull, grayish blue. The lighting was soft but unnatural, as though it came from no obvious source. The space itself was sparse, almost sterile, empty except for a few pieces of mismatched furniture, a worn armchair in the corner, a small, round table that looked like it belonged in someone's living room, and a bookshelf stacked with books that looked ancient, their spines faded and unreadable. It didn't make sense. I had pressed the button for the ground floor, my ground floor, the one I had used countless times before. This wasn't the lobby. This wasn't even the right floor. The elevator hadn't stopped on any other floors in between, and yet here I was, facing this strange, dim room, like something out of a dream or a nightmare. I stood frozen for a moment, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. The silence in the room was thick, oppressive, almost suffocating. I could feel my heart beating a little faster, my pulse quickening, but I couldn't bring myself to step out of the elevator. Something about this place, this room, felt wrong. It felt like I wasn't supposed to be here. I looked down at the button panel in the elevator, my fingers trembling as I reached out to press the button again, hoping it would take me to the ground floor as it always had. But when I looked at the display, I saw something I hadn't expected. The numbers were gone, completely blank. There were no floor numbers, no indication of which floor I was on or where I was supposed to go. Just empty, silent buttons. A deep, cold unease began to creep into my chest. I stepped out of the elevator, my feet hesitant, but the urge to understand what was happening, to make sense of the impossible, pushed me forward. I glanced back at the elevator doors as they slowly closed behind me, almost as if they were sealing me in, and then I turned to face the room again. There was a door on the far wall, slightly ajar, a faint glow of light spilling from the crack. Without thinking, I walked toward it, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the stillness. As I got closer, the sound of my footsteps seemed to distort, like they were bouncing off the walls in a way that didn't make sense. A hollow, muffled noise that made me pause and glance around. But there was no one here, just me. I reached for the door handle and pushed it open, half expecting to find another room, maybe a hallway, or something that would explain where I was, what had happened. But when the door swung open, I was met with something far more unsettling. The room was completely empty. No furniture, no walls, just blackness. A darkness that felt deep and endless, as if the space behind the door was consuming light itself. It was the kind of darkness that made the air feel thick, like it had substance, and the temperature seemed to drop instantly, a cold that crawled under my skin. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. What was this? What was this place? How was I even standing here, in a room that shouldn't exist, when just moments ago, I had been in a normal elevator, on my way to a normal floor? I slammed the door shut, the sound of the wood thudding against the frame echoing loudly in the silence. I looked around the room again, my chest tight, my thoughts racing. I had to get out of here. I had to leave. But as I turned to walk back toward the elevator, I noticed something strange. The bookshelf, the one with the faded books, was gone. In its place was a narrow hallway, barely visible, leading into even more darkness. The walls were lined with doors, no labels, no numbers, just dark wooden doors that seemed to stretch on infinitely. They were closed, sealed, as if they were waiting for someone to open them. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the hallway, my mind spinning with questions. What was going on? What was this place? How had it changed so quickly? I turned around again, heading toward the elevator, hoping I could somehow escape whatever this was. But when I reached the elevator doors, they didn't open. The doors were locked. The panel was completely unresponsive, the buttons still blank, as if the elevator had stopped existing altogether. I could feel panic rising, clawing at my chest, and I looked back toward the hallway, the doors now slightly ajar, as if inviting me to walk deeper into them, to discover what they were hiding. But I couldn't make myself do it. I turned, frantic now, trying the elevator doors again, pressing them with my hands, but they wouldn't budge. I felt the weight of the silence pressing in on me, and then, suddenly, the sound came again. Footsteps. Soft, almost imperceptible footsteps coming from down the hallway. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. I was alone, and the door at the end of the hallway was slowly opening, as though it had been waiting for me to finally see it. Something was coming, and I realized, too late, that the elevator had brought me here for a reason, into a place that was never meant to be found, to face whatever was hidden beyond that door. I had always taken the same walk through the park, my usual route on days when I needed to clear my mind. The park wasn't far from my apartment, just a few blocks, and it had always been a place of comfort. The paths were lined with trees that offered shade in the summer, and in the fall, the leaves turned into a golden carpet beneath my feet. It was quiet, peaceful, my sanctuary from the noise of the city. But that day, everything felt different. It started when I saw her. She was sitting on a bench near the edge of the park, her back to me. I hadn't seen her before, but I didn't think much of it. People passed through the park all the time. What struck me, though, was the feeling that tugged at me the moment I laid eyes on her. It was the way she sat there, so still, so at ease in a way that almost seemed unnatural. She was wearing a long coat, dark, with her hair tucked neatly under a scarf, and despite the cold breeze that had picked up, she didn't seem bothered by the chill in the air. Her presence was serene, but it carried an energy that made my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't explain. Without fully understanding why, I found myself walking toward her. When I was close enough, she turned to face me. Her eyes were striking intense, but without judgment. There was something familiar about her gaze, like I had seen it before in a dream, or perhaps in a memory I hadn't fully remembered yet. She smiled at me, but it wasn't an ordinary smile. It was knowing, as if she knew me better than I knew myself. "You seem like you need to be here," she said, her voice calm and measured. "This place is good for you." I was taken aback by her words. I hadn't said anything aloud, hadn't made any indication of my inner turmoil. Still, I nodded, not entirely sure why I was responding, why I felt the need to explain. "I come here often," I said, almost as if the admission would clear the odd tension I was feeling. "It's where I think—" She nodded, her eyes lingering on mine for a moment before she stood up, slowly and deliberately. Without another word, she gestured for me to follow her. Something in the way she moved, the quiet grace with which she walked, made it impossible for me to refuse. I found myself trailing behind her, my feet moving of their own accord, as though I were in a trance. We walked deeper into the park, away from the usual paths and toward a quieter, more isolated area that I had never ventured into before. The trees here were thicker, their branches intertwining, casting dark shadows on the ground. The air grew colder, heavier. It was as though the light had been dimmed, and the usual peace of the park had been replaced by an unsettling silence. I couldn't see any other people around, and yet I had the distinct feeling that we were not alone. She led me to a clearing near the center of the park. I didn't recognize it at all. There were no benches, no paths, just a large, open space surrounded by tall trees. And then I saw them. The ghosts. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Figures shifting, indistinct shadows standing near the edges of the clearing, barely visible in the dim light. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but it was impossible. They were transparent, like wisps of smoke, but they moved with intention, as though they were alive. Some were standing in stillness, others pacing slowly, their forms flickering in and out of focus like images in a fog. I turned to the woman who had led me here, my breath catching in my throat. She was watching me closely, her expression unreadable. "Do you see them?" I asked, my voice trembling. She nodded, her gaze never leaving the figures in the distance. "They've always been here," she said softly. "They're a part of this place, and a part of you too." My heart began to pound in my chest, a cold fear sweeping through me. I had heard of places where people had seen things, felt the presence of something they couldn't explain, but I had never believed it. Not until now. The figures in the clearing weren't mere figments of my imagination, they were real, or at least real enough for me to feel them. I took a tentative step forward, drawn by some unseen force, my legs shaking. The closer I got, the more I could make out the details of their forms. They were people, but not quite. Their faces were blurred, their features shifting and changing with every step I took toward them. I could hear faint murmurs, whispers that seemed to come from all directions, but no words I could understand. It was like standing at the edge of a memory, one I couldn't recall no matter how hard I tried. As I moved closer, a figure in the distance turned toward me. It was a woman, her face hazy but somehow familiar. She looked at me with eyes that I couldn't quite place, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I knew her. I knew that face. It was someone from my past, someone I had lost, someone who had disappeared long ago. I tried to call out to her, but the words wouldn't form. My voice caught in my throat. The figure took a step toward me, and as she did, the air around me thickened, the whispers growing louder. The temperature dropped even further, and I felt a pull, a tug inside me, as though I was being drawn into something far beyond my understanding. The woman who had led me here was still standing by the edge of the clearing, watching me silently. "Who are they?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "They're ghosts," she said simply, her gaze soft but distant. "But not in the way you think. These are the echoes of things lost, memories, regrets, parts of ourselves that we cannot let go. They've been waiting for you. Waiting for me," I repeated, my mind reeling with the impossibility of it all. "But I don't know them." She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the fog that had started to creep across the ground. I felt a wave of panic rise in me, but the strange pull I had felt before tugged harder now. I needed to stay. I needed to understand. I stepped closer to the figures, my feet moving of their own accord, and reached out toward the woman I had recognized, hoping to say her name, hoping to call her back to me. But when my hand touched her, she flickered, and for a moment I saw her face clearly. It wasn't her. Not really, it was me. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The others in the clearing turned toward me, their faces now clearer, their eyes all the same, my eyes. I recognized them all, but they weren't people I knew. They were reflections, echoes, versions of me lost moments, fragmented parts of myself I had buried and forgotten. And then, in a voice that wasn't mine, but felt like it belonged to me, the woman's voice whispered, "You've always been here, haven't you?" I turned and ran, but the figures followed, flickering, fading in and out of existence, always just behind me. The park, the clearing, the ghosts, everything was closing in, and I couldn't escape. And I realized then, in the deepest part of my soul, that the park had never been my sanctuary. It had always been a place where I could meet myself, where the past and the present were waiting for me to face them. And now I was surrounded by ghosts that weren't from my past at all. They were me. It was one of those gray mornings that seemed to stretch endlessly, where the sky was a blanket of thick clouds, and the air felt too heavy to breathe easily. I had been walking for hours, the kind of aimless wandering you do when you're trying to clear your head but find the thoughts only multiplying, not fading. The streets were quiet, too quiet. I kept my head down as I walked, the soles of my shoes tapping against the pavement in a rhythm that felt too deliberate, too forced. I needed a break. I needed warmth. A cup of coffee, something to break the monotony. So, when I saw the cafe tucked away on the corner, its warm, golden light spilling through the windows, I couldn't resist. The place was small, not much to look at from the outside, just a simple wooden door, a faded sign, and a few tables arranged along the narrow sidewalk. But there was something about it, something comforting in the way it seemed to exist apart from the world outside, as though it had been there forever, waiting for me. I pulled open the door and stepped inside. The bell above the door rang softly, and the warmth of the cafe enveloped me. The scent of freshly ground coffee and baked goods hit my senses, soothing the sharp edges of my thoughts. It felt like a safe space, a place where I could just pause for a while. I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs, and surveyed the room. There were a few people scattered around, sitting at tables, sipping their drinks, reading newspapers, and typing away on laptops. It looked like any other cafe, a quiet haven from the cold outside. But then, I noticed something. A feeling something off settled over me, like a shadow creeping in. The people, they weren't moving. I paused mid-step, my hand still gripping the door as I scanned the room again. The man at the corner table, who had been reading a newspaper when I walked in, hadn't turned the page. The woman in the booth near the back, whose cup of coffee should have been steaming, sat completely still, her hands resting flat on the table, as if frozen in place. The barista behind the counter, who should have been preparing drinks or interacting with someone, was just standing there, staring at nothing in particular. A blank look on his face. No one was talking. No one was moving. It was as though time had stopped for them, but I was still moving, still breathing. It wasn't the stillness you'd find in a room full of people who are absorbed in their own thoughts or quiet conversation. This was different. This was a stillness that felt wrong. I took a cautious step inside, the door clicking shut behind me. The sound seemed too loud, echoing in the oppressive silence. I walked further into the cafe, and as I did, every single person's gaze turned toward me. At first it was subtle, just the shift of their eyes, the faintest motion, but then it became more pronounced. All of them, at once, their eyes fixed on me, unblinking, unmoving. My breath caught in my throat, my pulse quickening. I could feel their stares like a weight, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. But they weren't speaking. They weren't even acknowledging my presence in any way beyond that unnerving gaze. It was as if they were watching me, but they weren't really there, not fully. They were frozen in time, locked in a single moment. I took another step forward, my shoes clicking against the floor. No one moved. No one shifted in their seats. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of the refrigerator behind the counter and the quiet ticking of a clock on the wall. It felt like I had walked into a scene from a dream, something half-remembered, something not quite real. I felt like an intruder, like I didn't belong in this space where time seemed to have stopped. I approached the counter, hoping to break the tension, to find something familiar in the barista's face. But when I reached it, I stopped cold. The barista's face was completely blank. His eyes, wide open, were staring straight ahead, but there was no recognition, no life behind them. I cleared my throat, stepping a little closer, but he didn't blink, didn't move. His hands were frozen midair, as if he had been reaching for something but had been caught in emotion he couldn't finish. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. "Can I get a coffee?" No response. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing. Something wasn't right. The silence was unbearable now, the stillness in the air suffocating. I felt as though the walls themselves were closing in on me. The eyes of the others in the room were still on me, their gazes unblinking, unwavering. I turned quickly, my eyes darting around the room, looking for some sign of life, some indication that this was just some bizarre moment, a misunderstanding, but there was nothing. They were all watching me. Their eyes followed my every move, their bodies frozen in place, like they were waiting for something to happen. Or worse, like they were waiting for me to make a move. I backed away from the counter, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The coffee machine hissed in the background, the sound too loud now, too jarring in the quiet. I needed to leave, I needed to get out. I turned toward the door, but before I could take another step, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from behind me. Leave. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one behind me. No one had moved. The cafe was still the same, silent, unmoving, with the eyes of every person locked on me. I didn't wait to hear anything else. I bolted for the door, my fingers fumbling with the handle, and pushed it open. The cold air hit me like a wave as I stepped out onto the street, but I didn't look back. I didn't even slow down. As I walked away, my pulse slowly began to calm, but the image of those unmoving faces, their eyes fixed on me, stayed with me. That feeling of being watched, of being trapped in that moment lingered, like a weight on my chest. I couldn't shake the thought that I had been part of something I wasn't meant to understand, something I had never been meant to see. And as I walked away, I couldn't help but wonder, were they still watching me? Or had the moment passed, the stillness finally lifted, leaving behind only the faintest echo of what had been? It was a typical evening, nothing unusual, nothing that would make me think twice. The kind of night where the city feels familiar, the streets a constant rhythm I've walked 1,000 times before. I was heading home, my steps slow and deliberate, the sky above just beginning to darken. The streetlights flickered on one by one as I made my way through the neighborhood, the comforting hum of the city accompanying me. The air was crisp, but the warmth of the day still clung to the pavement, and I could hear the faint murmur of voices from the nearby cafes and the rustle of cars passing by. I rounded the corner, heading down the narrow street I always took to get home. The street was quiet, save for a few distant sounds, footsteps, someone laughing, the low hum of traffic. And that's when I noticed it. The street sign had changed. It wasn't anything dramatic at first glance. It was a small thing, almost imperceptibly subtle shift that seemed to tug at the corner of my mind, like something out of place in a dream. I stopped and looked up at the sign, half expecting to see it just as it had been 100 times before. The familiar name of the street staring back at me. But it wasn't. It was the same name, but it looked different. The lettering was off, slightly blurred, and the metal beneath it seemed more worn, as though it had aged in a way that didn't make sense. I took a step closer, squinting, trying to make sense of the change. It wasn't just the font that was different, there was a subtle shift in the way the sign hung, the angle of it, like it had been there for much longer than it should have been. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out and tell me that it was all just a joke, or that I was imagining it. But the street was empty. The evening was quiet, as it always was. No one was around to explain it, no one to tell me I was wrong. I took a deep breath, shaking the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. "It's just a sign," I muttered to myself, trying to calm the inexplicable discomfort that was creeping up my spine. I continued walking, telling myself that I was overreacting, that it didn't matter. But even as I moved forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something that didn't fit. The sign shouldn't have looked like that. I shouldn't have noticed it at all. And yet, I did. I couldn't stop thinking about it. As I walked farther down the street, I came to the intersection where the road split into two. I had passed this same corner every day for years, and the path I always took was the one that led straight ahead. But when I reached the crosswalk, I hesitated. Something felt wrong, like I was standing on the edge of a decision I didn't understand. The street sign, now so ingrained in my mind, kept drawing my attention. It pointed straight ahead, but the name on it didn't match the street I thought I knew. I glanced up, expecting to see the same familiar street sign ahead of me, the one I had walked past every day. But instead, it was different again. The name had changed, and the sign looked older, more faded, like it had been there far longer than I could comprehend. It was the same sign pointing in the same direction, but something about it had shifted, as if the street itself had become something else. I turned around quickly, my heart racing, to look back down the street I had just walked from, but it was exactly the same. The street was unchanged. The houses, the buildings, the lights, they were all where they were supposed to be. There was nothing out of place, except for the sign. I took another step forward, then stopped again. The sign, that same sign, was now pointing toward the same direction, but the name of the street had changed once more. It was no longer the street I recognized, but another I couldn't name, another that didn't make sense in this part of the city. It was as if the city was rewriting itself, one small piece at a time, and I was stuck in the middle of it, unable to understand why. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt that familiar rush of panic that comes when you realize something isn't quite right, but you can't explain what's happening. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The street sign was still there, still pointing the same way, but now it felt like a beacon leading me somewhere I didn't want to go. It felt like a call, a pull, but I didn't understand where or why. I reached the corner and stood there for a moment, staring at the sign. Should I follow it? Should I turn back and pretend I hadn't seen anything unusual? I took another step, then another, my feet moving against my will, toward the sign that pointed in the direction I knew so well. But the further I walked, the more it felt like I was being led somewhere else, somewhere I didn't recognize, somewhere I couldn't return from. And then, as if the universe itself had decided to confirm my deepest fear, I looked ahead. There, at the end of the street, was a building I knew. But it wasn't the building I remembered. The windows were cracked, the door was hanging ajar, and the familiar structure I had walked past every day now looked like it had been abandoned for years, as though it had decayed overnight. I had never seen it like that before. It wasn't a simple illusion. It was a shift in the very fabric of the city itself. I stood frozen, staring at the building, the street sign still pointing toward it, as though it was beckoning me to step forward, to cross the threshold into something I didn't understand. But I knew, deep in my bones, that I couldn't. This place, this street, had changed. And I had changed with it. I turned around, quickly this time, and headed back the way I had come. The street seemed familiar again, the same street I had walked every day, but the weight of the sign lingered in my mind, like a shadow that refused to leave. The street was still there, but it felt like a different version of itself, one that didn't quite fit into the world I knew. And I realized, as I walked away, that the street sign hadn't really changed at all. It was still pointing the same way. It was I who had changed, and the city around me had shifted, subtly, as if it had always been this way. And maybe, just maybe, it was waiting for me to figure it out. It was a quiet afternoon when I first met her, though the air around us seemed to hum with something unspoken. She appeared out of nowhere, as most people do in stories that begin this way. I was sitting in the small cafe near the corner of the street, nursing a cup of coffee, lost in the monotony of my thoughts. The place was dimly lit, filled with the usual assortment of regulars, mostly solitary figures who came and went, their faces unreadable, their lives lived in half-glimpses. She walked in quietly, like a breeze, with the soft rustle of her coat and a calm that seemed at odds with the world around her. She wasn't striking in the way someone who demands attention is, but there was something about her presence, something that drew the eye and made you want to keep looking. Her hair was dark, her eyes calm but piercing, as if they saw more than they let on. She ordered her drink and sat down at the table next to mine, her gaze drifting to the window. I don't know why I started the conversation. Maybe it was the silence that hung in the air between us. Or perhaps it was the feeling that there was something more to her than met the eye. Whatever it was, I leaned over and spoke. "Are you new around here?" I asked, my voice tentative, unsure of myself. She turned to me, her eyes focused for a moment, and then softened into a smile. It was a small, knowing smile, as if she understood something I didn't. "Not really," she said, her voice smooth but with a certain weight behind it. "I've been here before, though it's been a while." I nodded, unsure of what to say next, but there was a feeling of connection, something strange that made me want to talk more, despite how quickly I could tell this wasn't an ordinary encounter. She leaned back in her chair and looked at me for a moment, as if weighing me, deciding whether or not to reveal something. Then, with a quiet grace, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She slid it across the table toward me, her fingers brushing mine briefly as she did. "Take this," she said softly, her voice dropping slightly, as if sharing a secret. "It will show you what you need to see." I stared at the paper for a moment, confused. It was an old map, the kind you'd expect to find in an antique store or tucked into the corner of some forgotten book. The edges were yellowed, the paper creased with age. But when I unfolded it, I saw something that made my breath catch, a map of the city. But it wasn't just any map. It was my city, the streets I had walked 1,000 times. The landmarks were all there, but they were drawn in faded, almost invisible lines. "Where is this from?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Where you are meant to go," she answered, her eyes locked on mine, intense and calm. "But it won't be clear at first. Don't worry. You'll see it when the time is right." I stared at the map, trying to make sense of it. There was something oddly familiar about it, something that made my chest tighten, but the streets seemed wrong. They weren't quite where they should be. The streets twisted in unnatural ways, some of them leading to places I didn't recognize, others that seemed to disappear off the page entirely. "Wait," I said, looking back up at her. "This doesn't make any sense. It's just a map." "But I don't understand." She smiled again, her eyes glimmering with that same quiet understanding. "You will," she said, her voice soft but certain. "Just keep it with you." She stood up, placing a few bills on the table, and walked toward the door, her coat trailing behind her as she exited the cafe, leaving me sitting there, stunned, holding the map in my hands. I looked at it again, my heart pounding in my chest. It didn't look any clearer, and the more I stared at it, the more I realized something strange. The streets on the map were shifting, like they were moving before my eyes. At first, it was subtle, a street that wasn't there before, a name that faded away, but as I looked closer, the changes became more pronounced. The map wasn't static at all. It was alive. I stuffed it into my pocket, feeling a strange sense of urgency, though I didn't know why. I left the cafe and walked outside, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled deep in my bones. The streets around me looked the same, the familiar faces, the same buildings, but everything felt different. The city was different. Like something was just a little off, like I wasn't really seeing it the way I had before. I pulled the map out of my pocket as I walked down the street. I needed to understand it, to make sense of it. But when I opened it up, I froze. It was blank. Completely blank. The streets I had seen before, the paths that had twisted and moved before my eyes, were gone. The map was just an empty page. No lines, no streets. Just the faint, yellowed edges of paper. My heart pounded as I turned it over, desperately searching for some sign, some clue as to what had happened. But there was nothing. It was as if the map had never existed at all. I stood there on the street corner, holding the blank map in my hands, confusion and fear beginning to take root in my chest. I glanced around, feeling a strange disconnect from everything around me. The people walked by, unaware of the strange reality I was holding in my hands. And that's when I realized something else. I didn't know where I was anymore. The streets, the city, everything felt foreign. The places I thought I knew were now unrecognizable. The buildings had changed, subtly at first, but enough to make me question everything I thought I understood. The map, whatever it had been, was now a piece of paper, its purpose lost to me. And I had no idea where I was meant to go. The directions, the paths, they were all gone. I took a step forward, still holding the map, still searching for some answer that would make sense of it all. But nothing felt right anymore. Nothing fit. I had been given something that I thought would guide me, but now I was lost in a city that no longer felt like home, with a map that didn't show the way, and in the quiet, empty space of the world around me, I realized something else. Maybe I hadn't been meant to find anything after all. Maybe the map wasn't meant to show me where to go. Maybe it was meant to show me that there was no way back. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of day where nothing feels special, and yet something is just. off. I had been on my usual commute, taking the bus home after work, not thinking much about it. The same route, the same stops, the same people getting on and off. It was a routine that had become so familiar, I could probably do it with my eyes closed. But that day, as I boarded the bus, something in the air felt different. The usual bustle of the city felt quieter, almost hushed. The weather too was unusually still. The sky was overcast, but there was no rain or wind, just this strange, heavy silence. I found my seat by the window, pulling my coat tighter around me as the bus lurched forward. The city rolled by, the familiar landmarks passing in their usual sequence: the bakery on the corner, the green park, the old cinema with its peeling sign. I looked out at the traffic, the pedestrians walking briskly down the sidewalks, their faces barely visible under umbrellas or scarves. It was all so routine, so normal. But then, after a few stops, something caught my eye. It wasn't immediate, but there was a shift in the air. I glanced out of the window, expecting to see the usual view of the city, but instead, something was wrong. It wasn't the view I was used to. The buildings had changed. The architecture was different now. The tall office buildings and familiar shops had been replaced by structures I didn't recognize: low, crumbling buildings that looked abandoned, their windows boarded up or missing entirely. The streets, which should have been filled with the usual hum of life, were eerily quiet. There were no pedestrians, no cars. The sidewalks were cracked and overgrown with weeds. The cityscape outside looked decayed, as if I had traveled back in time, or to a place that hadn't seen a living soul in years. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, thinking I had just missed something. But no. The city around me had shifted completely. It felt wrong, like I had stepped into a place that wasn't mine. I turned to look at the other passengers on the bus, trying to gauge their reactions, but they were all staring straight ahead, completely oblivious to the changes outside. No one seemed to notice. No one seemed to care. My heart began to race. I glanced at the bus number. Yes, it was the same route, the same number as always. The bus was heading in the direction I knew it always did, the one that would drop me off just a few blocks from my apartment. But everything had changed. The city had changed. I pulled the cord to signal for the bus to stop, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The bus slowed down, and I stood up, still unable to process the strangeness of it all. I stepped off the bus, my legs feeling unsteady as I made my way toward the door. When I stepped onto the sidewalk, it felt like stepping into a different world entirely. The air was thicker here, colder. The streets, so familiar in the past, were now foreign and unsettling. I looked around, trying to find something, anything that would reassure me I was in the right place, but nothing felt right. I couldn't see the landmarks I recognized, couldn't find anything familiar at all. I looked back at the bus as it pulled away, but it didn't stop at the corner like it usually did. It didn't even slow down. It simply drove off into the distance, disappearing into the fog that had started to roll in from nowhere. I stood there for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts, trying to figure out what had just happened. The bus had taken me to the same spot, but everything around me was different. The city I knew, the one I had lived in for years, was gone. In its place was a strange, decaying version of itself. A place that felt abandoned, forgotten. I started walking, my footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. The streets were empty, the air heavy with a sense of loss. I tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to me, suffocating me. The buildings, with their cracked walls and broken windows, seemed to loom over me, casting long, dark shadows that made the world feel even smaller, even more closed in. I walked for what felt like hours, retracing my usual steps, hoping that the city would return to normal, that I would see something familiar, anything to tell me I hadn't lost my mind. But the further I went, the more the city around me seemed to drift further away from the one I knew. There were no people, no traffic, no sounds, only the distant hum of something I couldn't place, like a low vibrating noise coming from somewhere deep in the earth. Eventually, I reached the end of the street. I looked around, feeling a cold dread settle in my chest. The city had changed, yes, but so had I. I had crossed some invisible boundary, and now I wasn't sure how to return. I turned around, but the streets behind me were no different than before. Every direction I looked in felt unfamiliar. I stood there for a long while, trying to process everything, trying to make sense of how my familiar city had turned into this empty, desolate place. And that's when I realized something that made the blood run cold in my veins. I hadn't taken the wrong bus. I had taken the same bus I always did, but this time, it had taken me somewhere else. Somewhere I didn't belong. Somewhere I couldn't escape. It was one of those nights where everything felt oddly off, but I couldn't put my finger on why. The kind of night where the air feels heavier than usual, where the sounds of the city seem just a little too muffled, as if the world is holding its breath. I had been walking around aimlessly, trying to clear my mind after a long, exhausting week. The city was quieter than usual. Most people seemed to be staying indoors, perhaps because of the sudden chill that had swept in with the evening breeze. As I walked past a little restaurant on the corner of the street, I felt an unusual pull toward it. The place wasn't anything special, just a small family-owned Italian joint that had been around for years. I'd passed by it countless times, but never had a reason to go in. Tonight, though, there was something about the warm light spilling through the windows, something inviting about the soft murmur of conversation that I could barely hear from outside. It felt like the right place to be in the moment. I stepped inside. The restaurant was cozy, with dim lighting and small tables covered with checkered cloths. The smell of garlic and fresh basil hit me immediately, making my stomach growl. It wasn't very busy, just a few people scattered around. The soft clinking of glasses and the low hum of chatter filled the air. I glanced at the menu, which hung on the wall above the counter, and found that everything looked delicious. Pasta, pizza, fresh seafood, it all sounded perfect. A waiter, an older man with a friendly face and a white apron, came over to greet me. His smile was warm, and his eyes had a kind, welcoming twinkle. "Good evening," he said, his voice soft but clear. "How can I help you tonight?" I smiled back, feeling oddly at ease. "I'd like a table for one, please." He nodded and led me to a small, intimate table by the window, near the back of the restaurant. The atmosphere felt calming, as if time moved slower here, and the noise of the world outside was left behind. The waiter handed me a menu, which I opened eagerly, scanning the list of dishes. It didn't take long to decide on a pasta dish, something creamy with mushrooms and truffle oil. My mouth watered at the thought. I placed the menu down, and the waiter returned to take my order. "I'll have the fettuccine with mushrooms and truffle oil, please," I said with a smile. He looked at me with a slight confusion in his eyes, his head tilting a little, as if trying to make sense of what I'd just said. "Pardon me," he said, after a moment, "but I don't have any record of your order. You didn't make a reservation, and—" I blinked, unsure if I had heard him correctly. What do you mean? I just told you my order." I felt a sudden sense of unease, a strange tightness in my chest. The waiter looked down at his notepad, then back at me. "No, I'm afraid you haven't ordered anything yet," he said, his voice still calm, but now with a hint of something almost apologetic, as if he didn't quite understand why I was confused. I furrowed my brow. "I just told you what I wanted, the fettuccine with mushrooms and truffle oil. That's all I need." My words came out a bit more forcefully than I intended, my confusion turning into something else, something deeper, like a subtle dissonance, a wrongness in the very air of the place. The waiter's expression didn't change. He didn't seem upset or even surprised by my insistence. He just stood there, his pen in hand, waiting for something. "You're sure you didn't make any other request? Perhaps a drink? Or a different dish?" he asked, his voice steady but somehow distant, as though he was asking me to remember something that I hadn't. I felt a wave of discomfort wash over me. No, I didn't ask for anything else. Just the pasta. "You're sure? Perhaps you've confused your order with someone else's." The waiter interrupted, his tone still polite, but beginning to carry a subtle edge of something I couldn't place. "That's quite all right. Sometimes it happens in places like this." He gave me another smile, but it seemed different, no more strained, more mechanical, like he was playing a part in a script he didn't quite understand. I stared at him, my mind racing. Something about his words, his calmness, was off. A knot tightened in my stomach, and I suddenly felt very small, very exposed. It was as though the room itself had shifted, like I was no longer sure of what was real or what wasn't. I looked around at the other tables, but everyone seemed to be eating, laughing, talking, as if nothing strange was happening. But the air felt thick now, as if the entire restaurant had grown heavier, more oppressive. "Look," I said, trying to steady my voice, "I don't understand. I ordered when I came in, and I'm telling you what I want." I felt my hands grip the edge of the table, the wood smooth and cold beneath my fingertips. "Can I just get the fettuccine, please?" The waiter looked at me again, his expression unreadable. "I'm afraid it's not on the menu right now," he said, his voice almost too calm. "Would you prefer something else?" I blinked, my mind struggling to keep up with the conversation. "It's not on the menu." "It's right there." I pointed to the menu on the wall, my voice rising a little in frustration. But when I looked, the menu had changed. The fettuccine I had seen moments ago was gone, replaced by other dishes I didn't recognize. I stared at the list in confusion. "No, that wasn't there a second ago," I muttered, my voice trembling now. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the sweat forming on the back of my neck. The waiter didn't respond right away. He just stood there, looking at me with that same calm, almost placid expression, his eyes slightly narrowed, as if watching me from a distance. "You've been sitting here for a while," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "Perhaps you'd like to choose something else." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. My stomach churned, and a sinking feeling settled deep in my chest. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. Suddenly, a cold realization hit me, and I didn't know if I could speak it aloud, or if I even wanted to. But it didn't matter, because the restaurant had already begun to change. The tables, the walls, the lights, all of it seemed to blur together, as if they were fading in and out of focus. The people at the other tables' faces I hadn't noticed before began to look distant, their laughter muffled, their movements stiff and slow, like they were part of a dream I couldn't wake up from. I stood up, shaking, and glanced back at the waiter. He was still standing there, waiting, his pen poised in mid-air as though nothing was amiss, as though everything was perfectly fine. And that's when I realized it. I had never ordered. I had never even sat down at the table. I had walked into the restaurant, yes, but it wasn't my order that had brought me here. And it wasn't the food I was waiting for. I had been waiting for something else. Something much darker. And whatever it was, it hadn't come yet. It was a typical evening, the kind that always felt too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. I had been walking around the city for hours, lost in my own thoughts. The usual hum of the city life drowned out by the soft thrum of my footsteps against the wet pavement. The rain had stopped, but the air still held that dampness, that chill that made everything feel a little more distant, a little more detached. The streetlights above flickered intermittently, casting long, uneven shadows that made the city feel even more like a stranger. I had no particular destination in mind. I rarely did. I just walked, letting my feet guide me, letting my mind wander as the world blurred around me. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional car passing by, its tires skimming over the water on the ground, sending up little splashes of light in the otherwise dark night. I took a turn down a side street I hadn't noticed before. It was narrow, tucked between two older buildings, and the farther I went, the quieter it became. The faint noise of the city, distant voices, the buzz of neon signs faded completely, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable silence. The street felt oddly deserted. No cars, no people, just me, walking deeper into the alley. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The buildings around me were old, worn, with cracked bricks and peeling paint. But it wasn't just their disrepair that unsettled me. It was the way they seemed to press in, leaning toward me from either side, as though they were closing in, narrowing the space with every step I took. I kept moving, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but the tension in the air only grew. The alley was darker now, the overhead lights barely illuminating the ground beneath my feet. And then, as I continued walking, I noticed something. The sound of my footsteps had changed. They were no longer echoing off the buildings, no longer bouncing back to me. It was as if the ground had absorbed them completely, leaving no trace of sound. The silence was absolute. I stopped and looked around. There were no windows, no doors on the buildings to my left and right, only solid, grimy walls. It was as if this alley was a forgotten part of the city, hidden away, unseen by the rest of the world. I took another step forward, but then something caught my eye, a faint glow at the end of the alley. At first, I thought it was just another streetlight, or maybe the reflection of something in a window, but as I walked closer, I realized it wasn't either of those things. It was a door. A large, old wooden door set into the wall at the far end of the alley. It stood out against the darkness, its edges faintly glowing, like it was illuminated from within. I felt an odd pull toward it, a compulsion I couldn't explain. There was something about the door, its strange light, its isolation that seemed both inviting and foreboding at the same time. I approached it cautiously, my heart quickening, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I reached out, my hand hovering just inches from the handle, when I heard a sound behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was faint, just the whisper of fabric brushing against something, the faintest creak of a footstep. But when I turned, there was no one there. The alley was as empty as it had been when I entered. I shook my head, trying to brush off the feeling of unease that was creeping up my spine. I reached for the door again, my fingers wrapping around the cold metal handle. With a deep breath, I twisted it and pushed the door open. What I saw on the other side wasn't what I expected. I stepped through the door, expecting to be greeted by the familiar cityscape, the streets that lay just beyond the alley. Instead, I found myself standing in nothing. The world on the other side of the door was empty, a blank void that stretched out infinitely in every direction. There were no buildings, no streets, no lights. Just darkness. I stepped back, my pulse racing. I tried to push the door shut, but it wouldn't move. It was as if the door was stuck in place, held open by some unseen force. Panic began to rise in my chest, and I turned to look behind me, expecting to see the alley still stretching out, the way I had come in. But it wasn't there. I was no longer in the alley. I was standing in the middle of a featureless, empty space, the air thick with a heavy, unnatural silence. I turned in a circle, my breath coming faster now, my mind racing. There were no walls, no horizon, no landmarks, just a never-ending expanse of nothing. I reached out again, trying to find something, anything to hold on to, but the nothingness was endless, stretching out beyond my reach. My heart pounded in my chest, the feeling of isolation closing in around me, pressing against my chest like a vice. The door behind me began to creak again, as if something was pushing against it from the other side, and I stumbled backward, my hands pressing against the empty air, trying to push myself away from the door. But it felt like I was floating, suspended in nothingness. The ground beneath me was gone, the walls were gone, and I was caught in an endless void. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the door slammed shut. I was left standing there, alone in the dark, surrounded by nothing. I turned in a circle, searching for any trace of the alley, any sign that I had ever been there, but there was nothing. There was no trace, no remnants of the world I had come from. And that's when it hit me. The alley wasn't real. The door wasn't real. This place, this endless, empty space, wasn't real. I had walked into something that didn't exist, a place outside of time, outside of reality. A dead end that had no beginning, no end. And now I was stuck here, with nothing but the suffocating silence and the cold, unfeeling void. I was walking home after a long day, the streets quiet, the city humming faintly in the background. It had been one of those dull, forgettable days, just the usual grind. But something about the evening felt different. The sky was tinged with that soft purple glow of dusk, and the air was thick with the scent of wet pavement, the residue of rain from earlier in the day. My footsteps echoed on the sidewalk, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though there was no one around. I turned a corner, following my usual route home, when something on the ground caught my eye. It was small, half buried under a pile of fallen leaves, barely noticeable. I stopped and bent down to pick it up. It was a key. A simple, old-fashioned brass key, its edges worn with time. I turned it over in my fingers, feeling the cold metal against my skin. There was no tag, no label, no indication of what it belonged to. I stood there for a moment, staring at the key, feeling an odd sense of curiosity mixed with unease. I had never seen anything like it before, but there was something compelling about it, something that made me want to hold on to it. So, I slipped it into my pocket and continued on my way, though the weight of it in my pocket felt heavier than I expected. When I got home, I threw my bag on the couch and went into the kitchen to make a cup of tea, trying to shake off the strange feeling the key had left me with. It was just a key, I told myself. A random object I found on the street. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't stop thinking about it. There was something about it that didn't sit right with me, something that kept gnawing at the edges of my mind. I stood up from the couch and walked over to the small table by the door, where I kept a drawer full of odds and ends. I had no real reason to, but I opened the drawer anyway and found a small wooden box hidden in the back, buried under old receipts and half-forgotten trinkets. It had a simple lock, nothing special, but something about the box made me feel like it was important, like it held something I needed to see. I'd never even thought to open it before. I pulled the key out of my pocket and slid it into the lock of the box. It fit perfectly. I turned it, and the box clicked open. Inside, there was nothing. Not a single thing. No letters, no hidden treasure, no mementos, just emptiness. I stared at the inside of the box, trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out why this was happening. Why did this key, this random key, fit? Why had it led me here, to a box that was supposed to hold something, but was completely empty? Confused, I closed the box and placed it back in the drawer, my mind racing. Maybe I was just tired, maybe I was imagining things. But the sensation that something was wrong, something I couldn't quite understand, kept building. It felt like the key, the box, and everything that had happened since I picked it up were part of something I wasn't seeing, something just out of reach. I went to bed that night with the key still in my pocket, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept circling back to it, to that empty box, to the way the key had fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for me. The feeling of unease deepened, and the more I tried to dismiss it, the stronger it became. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the key. I took it out of my pocket, turning it over in my hands again, but this time I noticed something I hadn't before. There was a faint marking on the side of the key, small, almost imperceptible engraving. It wasn't anything I recognized, but it looked like some kind of symbol. I squinted at it, trying to make sense of the design, but the more I stared, the more elusive it seemed, like it was shifting just out of my view. I decided to go back to the spot where I had found the key, just to see if there was anything else, anything that might make sense of it all. I retraced my steps, walking the same path, but when I reached the spot where I had picked up the key, there was nothing. The ground was bare, the leaves scattered and damp, as if no one had ever been there. No key, no sign of anything unusual. I walked around for a while, hoping to find some clue, some explanation, but it was as if the whole event had never happened, as if the key had simply appeared out of nowhere, and now it had vanished. I went home, feeling more confused than ever, but as I sat down on the couch, something caught my eye, a slight glimmer from the corner of the room. I turned to look, and there, resting on the table where I had left it the night before, was the box. The same box, the one I had locked and left in the drawer, sitting open now, as though it had never been closed. I stood up, my heart racing, and approached the box cautiously. Inside it, this time, there was something. A small, folded piece of paper. I reached inside and unfolded it, my hands trembling. The writing was neat, careful, but the words made no sense. They were a series of symbols, the same ones engraved on the key. And then, beneath the symbols, there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. Asterisk, it's not the door you're looking for. I froze, staring at the words. The box, the key, the symbols, it was all connected. But connected to what? What was it trying to tell me? I put the paper down, my mind racing, but before I could think further, there was a knock at the door. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly went to open it, feeling a sense of dread I couldn't explain. When I opened the door, there was no one there, but lying on the doorstep was another key. This one was different, and it had my name engraved on it. The realization hit me with a cold rush. I wasn't meant to find just one key. The first key wasn't meant to open anything at all. It had only led me to this moment, to this door, to the second key. But which door would it open? And more importantly, would I be ready for what was behind it?